So here we are. We're here to talk about the Trinity. You guys missed all this in the classroom. I was curious if people had questions or comments from the reading. Just anything we want to get out on the table at the start to factor into our discussion. And, you know, how did it strike you, what you read? What things do we need to touch on today? This is asking you to be part of setting the agenda. Yes, Liz.
Okay, I'll go. I posted it on the discussion post, but nobody has answered, so I'll ask you. So last year, from two different people, I heard the argument that father does not really exist in the original biblical language, that instead it comes more from like a word of like a life giver, and therefore, you know, we should not so much as rely on identifying with God as a father, first because of that, and then second because a lot of people have grown up with absent fathers or abusive fathers, and they cannot identify with how God could be a father when all they've known from a father is neglect. So I just wanted to know where that argument bases itself on, because I mean, as far as I can see, and I've read in both the English and Spanish translations, God is referred to in a masculine form, not just as a father, but also as like the groom with the bride, with the church, Jesus as the son of man. And, you know, I just wanted to know if there was anything that you could point me into why these people would bring this argument forth. And I do have to add that the people who did the argument did also say that they had troublesome relationships with their fathers.
Good question. That'll be an important one to talk about. What else? Nancy, yeah.
I like the models that he showed, you know, the relational, social, and all that. It really like gives a broader view of what the Trinity is and explaining it.
That it's more than just a difficult math problem, but it says something about who God is, you mean?
Yeah.
Cool. Anything else? Okay, I'm not gonna forget your question, Liz. I'm gonna kind of get a run at it though. And feel free, guys, to jump in along the way with comments and questions today too. And we'll just see how this goes. I think one of the things that struck me from the chapter was the idea that the Trinity is there in the beginning, before the beginning. It's there in the end, like from start to finish, God is triune. And I think that was one of his, one of the things he was trying to establish is like, this isn't something, this is inherent to the nature of God. So if that's true, God has always been Father, Son, and Spirit, which I think later on, yeah, he's going to deal some more with some of the early heresies. One of the ones he talked about in this chapter was Arianism, which basically proposed that the Son was God's first creation, right? So he did not eternally exist. And Reeves' response is, well, fundamentally changes the nature of God, right? If he hasn't always been in this father, son, spirit relationship. And so what does that reality, if that's the case, that God was and is and always will be Father, Son, and Spirit, what does that change about how we understand his fundamental nature? In other words, what's the significance? Why does it matter? Yeah, Matthew.
So the reason why it matters is if Christ was created, he's not the same as God. He's not on the same level as God. As the Bible says, he did not think it robbery to be equal with God.
Mm-hmm.
That's because he is God. If he's a created being, he is, as the Mormons might say, a brother to Satan, who is also a created being. And without that inherent godness, without his inherent divinity, he couldn't truly redeem us.
Okay, so you bring up the fact that creates a Christological problem or difference about the nature of Christ and whether he's fully divine, which in turn creates a soteriological problem. In other words, soteriology is the theology of salvation. That changes Christ's ability to save us, both of which are true. What does it change about theology proper? In other words, about God himself? Timothy, I saw your hand, but I'm not sure if that was a...
So it changes the fact that, well, in our belief, the way at least I believe, hopefully most other people are like this too, but he actually died himself in that way. And of course, there's all kinds of interesting questions with that, but I don't think you want to get into those right now. But there's a certain level of sacrifice and love that's involved with God dying for us compared to, I just made a perfect dude to go out and die for you.
Yeah, so in other words, if God has always been Father, Son, and Spirit, and the Trinity is like they're all God, then when Christ comes, whatever he does, God is doing, is what you're saying. And so God himself is suffering and dying for the sake of his beloved people. That's what I'm hearing you say. So it's not, so salvation, in other words, coming back to salvation, is not something that God does or accomplishes at a distance. It's not something that he delegates to someone else. Even though there's, like, if you look at the Gospel of John, there's this kind of clear, order about it. Like, Jesus gets his marching orders from the Father and he carries it out. But in a Trinitarian perspective, it's still God himself. Jesus also says, I do the work that I do is my Father's work. So God himself is the one entering into our human predicament and rescuing us from it. Go ahead.
I'm slightly disappointed that we didn't keep the phone now that I'm thinking about it, because we could have just messed around. But I also wanted to mention, since you were talking about him doing himself and all that, that it's like that old rule of leadership, right? You don't ask someone to do something for you that you wouldn't do yourself. God didn't ask us to take up our cross because he's just asking that. He's asking us to take up our cross because he has a right to, since he did it first.
Yeah. And this kind of takes me back too to what we've been exploring the last few weeks about God's name and his kind of these essential character qualities that we find in Exodus that he reveals about himself: slow to anger, abounding in love, all those kinds of things. There's often these caricatures that we talked about. In fact, if you were listening along with the Bible Project, one of the podcasts that they did was on God's anger, and they talk about the different words for anger. And they, at one point, they read just like 3 of them, and there's way more than 3 in the Bible, right? But they read just these 3 where God sounds like pretty ticked off, and they make the point that if you take those out of their context in the whole narrative of the Old Testament, then it's easy to create a caricature of a God who's really kind of maybe vicious or hot-tempered, and does kind of, I don't know, smashes people without really caring too much about them, kind of more like a tyrant than a father. And I'm tying this back. I'm trying to tie this back to your comment. And there was a clear thread when I started, but there's also this really annoying ringing going on in the hallway that's sort of messing with my brain. So sorry about that. But I remember what it was. It's the disconnect that we have between, and we've talked about this before, but between kind of Jesus and the God revealed in the New Testament and the God revealed in the Old Testament. And I think so often that's just a result of we're not reading the whole story. And when we take these isolated instances of who God is out of their context in the story, it's easy to misinterpret. But this reality that in Christ, God himself is reconciling the world to himself, and he's doing it by his own self-giving and his own sacrifice, like that has to reframe the way we read the Old Testament and where we put the focus, or where how we put passages about, say, anger or wrath or judgment or punishment, how we frame those in the context of God's character. Because we've seen, and this is what the prologue of John tells us, is that the Word became flesh, made his dwelling among us, and we've seen his glory, the glory of the one and only, full of grace and truth. And as we've already found out, that's a link back to Exodus 34. He's saying what we see in Jesus is the revelation of the Father, and because they're one. Okay, so that was sort of a short rabbit hole, but so we see that God is, I think what you told me, Tim, is that he's self-sacrificial, because whatever Jesus does, God does. Is there anything else that either you picked up from the reading or that you've thought about, that how this reality of Father, Son, and Spirit changes the way we think about who God actually is, or what kind of being he is? Yes.
Sorry for coming up for a third time, but I actually thought a little bit about this before, about the reason why it doesn't really work for Jesus to be anything but God himself. And one of the big things that came up is he claims to be the Son of Man, right? He claims all of these things. He claims to have the will of God. He claims to have the authority of God. And if he claims all of those things, he's basically claiming to be God. Hence why the priests rip their robes and are like, all right, what more evidence do we need? Let's go put him on the cross.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's untrue, though, if he's not God, if he's not the Son of Man, if he's not all of these things that he claims to be, then he's a liar. And if he's a liar, that throws the entirety of the Bible out of the way. That takes the New Testament and tosses it out a window. So he has to be true or he has to be a lie. There's no other choice.
Yeah, it's the I don't know if you've ever read that famous passage from C.S. Lewis where he talks about Jesus being either liar, lunatic, or Lord. He's either consciously deceiving people, or he's lost his mind, or he's telling the truth and he is who he says he is. And of course, Lewis says it more eloquently than I just did, but I'm not C.S. Lewis. The thing too, a couple other things struck me as I was reading and thinking through this. And one of them was emphasized a lot already by Michael Reeves. But if God is eternally Father, Son, and Spirit, he can be eternally love. Like John tells us, God is love. I think the only other things that we hear God is, like essentially is light. John says God is light. And I don't know if it ever says God is like holy or holiness, but it certainly says holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, right? So this idea of love being essential to God's nature can only be true if God is a community of being. Unless he's just loving himself. And if he's just loving himself, then I don't think that's the kind of God we want to worship, right? Besides the fact that, as Tim pointed out, what Jesus has demonstrated about the Father is that his love is others focused, right? It's directed toward his Son and the Spirit and his creation. By the way, just as a quick aside, God loves people, but he also loves the world, i.e., like the cosmos. And in our evangelical circles, we talk a lot about God loving us, which is gloriously true. But he also loves everything that he's made, and he cares for it, and he calls us to participate in that. That has nothing to do, well, I don't think, with the Trinity. Well, it probably does. But just a quick side note. It also means, it strikes me that this is kind of an awakening I'm having over the last few years. How big of a deal family is in the Bible. It strikes me that the way God chooses to reveal himself in the person of Jesus is in familial terms. And I think that's hugely significant. Jesus calls himself the Son and talks about his Father, but he's doing it as the Son of Man, right? Which I haven't fully chased this out, but I take that at this point to mean the truly human one, the one who truly embodies and carries out the human vocation. that was given to us. He is the image of God, right? He's doing and being what we were called to do and be. And if he's relating to God as his father, then that's indicative of the way we ought to relate to God. And so if you kind of retroject that back, which is a little bit dangerous, but I think that's part of what Jesus came to do, is to reveal to us how we ought to understand God and read scripture. So if you look back at the story in light of that, then you can reach the point of saying God, when he created people, was creating a family, his family. He's always wanted us to be a family. So I want to kind of take a little flyover of some Old Testament texts and tease this out a little bit, and then we'll come back and make sure we get Liz's question. But Liz, you had another thought right now.
Yeah, as you were like talking about God as Father forever, and as I was reading it, as I was reading Reeves' writings last night, the way the church, the way we as Christians talk about God, and the way we even preach about God, we usually talk about him as creator, and we don't talk about him as being father. It's almost like, as Reeves says, that this is just like a role that God sometimes takes, and it's not, it is who he is. Yeah. And has always been. And I feel that that's a huge game changer in us as Christians, if we were to accept that and really dwell in that and recognize that. And also if we were to preach about God the Father as who he is. I believe that you quoted, and I forgot the name of the scientist, but he's an atheist, and he was saying how God is a tyrant and God is just evil and he's the worst. And it's like, that's because everything he's ever heard of and everything he's ever read about God is as God creator and not God the Father. Like Reeves said, if you have a creator, then the creator needs creation in order to fulfill the role of creator. You know, if you have a ruler, then you need something to rule over, and that's all you're gonna have, a ruler. But when you have a father, he will love like a father. He has always been a father. He will always love as a father. And I just wanted to add that absolutely recognizing that God has always had a plan of a relationship with us would be such a huge change in how we preach about him as well to people who don't believe, and not just as creator. Yes, he is, but that's not all that he is. He's not just creator. He is a father, and he wants that relationship with us and with those that don't believe in him yet.
Yeah, very well said. And that's actually a great segue into your other question. Yeah, Matt.
I just wanted to say, when Liz was talking about how the church tends to say God is a father, but then doesn't really talk about it much, I think it's kind of how a lot of people deal with conflicting problems. They just try to compartmentalize it. Okay, he's this and this time, this and this time. And we need to realize that God is beyond our understanding, in that he can be all of these at the same time.
Yeah. And even the ones that seem like their intention, right? He can be. I'm going to share a picture. I think. Okay, you guys see the sun?
Yes.
So if this is a picture of theology of our this is a way of visually describing what we believe about God, then what we put right here matters a lot. And I think that's what Reeves is forcing us to think about. Like, is father like an appendage that we kind of stick on, or is it the core, right? And you're right, Liz, that like what we put in the center it changes everything. It changes how we think about salvation. Well, our relationship to God and his salvation of us, right? Let's for a second put creator in the middle. That means we're creatures, and all this is true, right? He is creator, we're creatures. We're God is transcendent, we're in the created realm. We have to look up to him, and really our role is to worship him, give thanks to him, and our problem is that we don't do that, right? And so God comes and rescues us so that we can rightly glorify him, right? The Westminster Shorter Catechism says the chief end of man is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. Now, sometimes we shrink that to glorify God. And it kind of fits this creator at the center model, where we're just the lowly creatures, and we are we need to be remade into proper worshipers. Now, that's all true. I mean, if you read Romans 1, the problem is that we worship and serve created things rather than the creator who's forever praised. Amen. Right? And we get into all this idolatry, and that's a problem. And God comes to right that problem and to remake us. But by the time you get to Romans 8, Paul's talking about the Spirit by whom we cry out, Abba, right? He's saying we become right worshipers, we become humbled creatures, and in that process we also become children, or we recognize that we're children who can cry out to our Father and seek to know him and be loved by him, and we inherit all this amazing inheritance from him, and we share in the sonship of the Son. So, okay, there's creator. How about let's put king or judge in the center? And I'm going to put those both together because in the ancient context, the king was the judge. They didn't have like a republic like we have, where there's like a separation of powers. The king was the law and the executive and the judge. Now, he had other people helping him with all that stuff, but kings would render judgment. So if we put king judge in the middle, then we owe God allegiance and obedience. And our problem is that we don't give him that. And so we stand under judgment. And so he has to come and basically, this is a very common way of thinking about, the work of Christ. He bears the punishment for our sin, or he kind of pays the penalty that was due. He carries out our sentence because we were guilty. The wages of sin is death, so he dies our death. Again, all that is true. But if you think about the relationship between a defendant in court and the judge, there's a certain respect there. There's an honor that's due. There's a reverence or fear. You know, this person has the power of life or death over me. But you wouldn't necessarily love the judge, even if he rendered you not guilty, and even if it was on the count of his own son who sacrificed for you. And I thought that was important, the distinction that Reeves made between gratitude and love. Like, you can have gratitude without love. So I'm trying to think if there's any other things I need to put here in the center. I think you get the idea. But if you then put Father in the center, now the relationship is defined in terms of receiving love. I mean, receiving life. Fathers are the ones who give life to their kids. Of provision and care, and there's discipline, and there's respect, and there's reverence due, and all those other things still come into play. But the relationship between a father and a son has some elements that those others don't. And I think we see through the revelation of Jesus Christ that that's how he related to God as the true human being. And that's how he invites us by our union with him as the Son to relate to God as our Father. And I don't think this is a new idea. So before I kind of chase it through the Old Testament, I want to go back to the comment from the atheist and the idea that we have a habit, I would say, of projecting our understanding of certain roles onto God. Okay? If you think about, let's go back to the king and the judge. We have a proverb in English that says, power corrupts. Right? This is like axiomatic. Because for human beings, that's usually true. I mean, maybe it's always true, at least to some degree, right? It's really hard to be responsible with power. That's what we were created to do, but we're fallen creatures. We have more to say about sin in a few weeks, but we're turned in on ourselves, and so we use our power to our own advantage. Precisely the opposite of what Matt quoted a while ago, where Jesus, though being in very nature God, didn't consider his equality with God something to be clung to or used to his own advantage, is one way you can translate that phrase. Like, he's not grasping his power for his own benefit. And if that's true of Jesus, that means that's true of God. He is a king unlike any king that has ever walked the face of the earth other than Jesus Christ, who poured himself out, gave his life as a ransom for many, washed his disciples' feet, pick your metaphor. So when we see or read in scripture about God as king or judge, we think in human terms. Well, God is maybe he's a little corrupt, or maybe he's a little greedy with his power, or why is it that he creates a bunch of creatures just to glorify him? Is he like need someone to stroke his ego? Is he that insecure? Or if he's a judge, is he really impartial? Does he really get it right every time? Because we can read the text and say, man, in some of these stories, it seems like he's overplaying the judge card a little bit, right? He's a little harsh. Again, if we read these in isolation from the rest of the story, and sometimes even if we don't, it raises questions. And so we have these categories of judge and king and creator and ruler and all that we see humans fulfill, and we see humans fulfill them poorly. And then we have to wonder, well, is God like that? And I think that's exactly the same thing that happens with Father, which is why the concern that you raised, Liz, is so legitimate. That we are prone to, and we really almost have no choice but to project our experience of a father onto God. And for some people, the leap from the Father that we have to God the Father is, a good long jump. But for some people, it's like a chasm that you couldn't imagine crossing. And what do we do about that? That's a difficult question, because sometimes as soon as you even use the word, you create difficult associations. You create, you start bringing the wrong picture in, or you bring traumatic experiences to the surface. And I think that's partly why it's so important for the church to tell the story, because stories have the power to retrain our minds and our our perception of a certain role, because we can in a sense we can inhabit another person's shoes if we are hearing a story or reading a story, and we can see, for example, if we read the story of the Gospels, we can see how Jesus relates to God as Father and what he says about God as Father, and how he believes, what he believes about God as Father. And we can see what he says about how his Father loves him and how he treats him. And we can begin to wonder, well, maybe there's a different kind of Father in the room, in a way that just sort of trotting out attributes of God as doctrines that can be helpful. But I think that's one of the reasons why God speaks to us in a story. Go ahead, Liz.
Yeah, so as I'm thinking about, the people who may struggle at the beginning to recognize God the Father because of their past, it reminds me that so many times we are very self-focused. As soon as we hear, oh, God the Father, oh, well, my Father, well, my experience, well, I believe, well, I've suffered. And we don't realize that God the Father it wasn't God the Father and the Spirit, and then created human beings, and then he was like, oh, I should create a son so that they can identify with me as a father. So let me create the son and send him for it. He has always been a father. What we know, even those of us who have loving fathers and caring fathers, even that cannot compare to what God the Father is, the with like capital T, because he is the ultimate Father. The fathers on earth are like a minuscule, tiny little reflection of all that the Father is. So it's not about what we know, it's not about what we have been through, it's about who he is. He is the point of reference. He is who we should hold as the highest standard. And I believe that if we were to begin with that in church and say, hey, God has always been the Father, and the Father is love. He didn't decide to become a father to identify with us. He is the point of reference. Then that can, instead of causing questions and denial in people, it can be like, oh, so I'm right. The father that I've had has never been who he was supposed to be. But there is somebody who has always been forever and ever there for me. And I believe that that would probably, like you said, that would be like the game changer when it comes to preaching to people who have suffered with their father figures or even male figures in their lives, that it's not that these people reflect who God should be. No, God is the point of reference. He is who we are supposed to compare the earth relationships to, and not the other way around.
Yeah. Well said again. It takes me back to this notion of humans as the image of God and Jesus as the true image. He's the one who shows us what a son is supposed to be, because none of us come close. None of us give the response of love and obedience that we were called to give. But part of that is when we grow up and have kids, we don't, we still are not being faithful images of God completely. And so what a father, one of the roles that a father and a mother are supposed to have is, and this is like, oh my word, you know, this is a weighty responsibility, is to be a picture of the love and care of God to our children. And like you said, none of us come close. You know, we do the best we can, but at some point we all fail. And so there's this tension, I think, between the really good idea that God had, that he would reveal himself through human beings. He would execute his dominion through image bearers who, you know, rule and reign for him. He would reveal his nature through the mystery of marriage and the oneness between, you know, two people who are different yet who come together and share a oneness, and that he would create this thing called families so that fathers and mothers could reveal something of the care and love and nurturing and discipline that he has for his creatures. That's a really brilliant idea, but in a fallen world, it just never works out. And so you're right, we have to preach and teach and tell the story, and start with the truth that God is not your dad. And people have done studies, I think it's fascinating, on, I've never read any of them, so I can't, I'm just aware that they exist, on some of the most prominent atheists in history, and on some of the most like horrible people, like Hitler. They all had very strained or non-existent relationships with their fathers. Like they had deep father wounds. And that makes a difference. So we talk about people who are wounded by the church and they get disillusioned and they say, I'm done with this. You can be wounded by the church. You can also be wounded by your parents, and it impacts your relationship with God. And in a sense, that's kind of how it's meant to be. But the church has to really work to say, God is not your dad. God is not us. We have to also differentiate between God's people and God. And I think that's tricky, because God has identified himself in such a way, you know, this idea that we bear his name. We're meant to carry his character and reflect his image to the world. But we also have to acknowledge and help people see that because we don't do that accurately, you have to maybe look at us at some level, but really you just need to turn your gaze toward the Father, Son, and Spirit and find out what he's really like. So I think that's a good break point. We have about 20 minutes left, so let's take a couple minutes, move around, look outside, and get your blood flowing. We'll come back at 46 and take it the rest of the way. All right, so before we jump to the next thing, as we were breaking, I was thinking it is important for me to add, you know, people might watch this on YouTube, or people already who have been hearing this might be internally kind of struggling, because maybe you are that person who's had a strained relationship with your father. I mean, all of us have to some degree, but you know, obviously some people, this is a much more real, visceral kind of feeling that can come up when these conversations come up. And by saying kind of clearly or bluntly, you know, God is not the same as your dad, I don't mean at all to deny the difficulty of dissociating those two characters. Yeah. Because again, I think God actually designed it so that we do. I was reading something or listening to something recently, like, you know, for a baby, you know, you look up and you just see these giants who, you know, talk to you and provide for you and wipe your butt and all this thing. It's like, well, what else are you supposed to think? You know, you're totally helpless without them. And so it's natural to associate God with a parent. And it's very difficult to dissociate those things. And so I don't want to minimize that struggle. But I want to say, and I haven't had it personally to the degree. I mean, I was blessed. I had good parents, but I know it's possible to learn how to relate to God as a different kind of person than the one you've known, because I know people who've done it. So I think I hope that's a hopeful thing. So what I'd like to do with our last few minutes is just kind of walk through the story a little bit. And I didn't do this super systematically. I just kind of thought of some key points where this notion of God as Father comes up. And I should say at the outset, it's pretty rare in the Old Testament. You know, Jesus comes along, and all through the Gospels, Father is the name, by and large, that he uses to talk about God. And I think that's intentional. And there are just sort of small hints of it, actually, in the Old Testament. It's not a way that the people of Israel would refer to God commonly. But there are some, I think, really important places where it does show up. So let's start in Genesis, where I like to start. In chapters 2 and 3 is where we get the creation of Adam and Eve. And it doesn't use any language of father, and it doesn't even use any explicit language of children, although I'm becoming more convinced that the notion of Adam and Eve as image bearers does have kind of a familial reference to it. I think that you can make a case that God creating image bearers is about God creating children. Part of that is from Genesis 5. It says, when God created human beings, he made them in the likeness of God. He created them male and female and blessed them. And when they were created, he called them human beings. And then Adam lived 130 years. He had a son in his own likeness, in his own image, and he named him Seth. So you've got a human being having a son after his likeness and naming him, right after it talks about God creating human beings in his image. And if you put the two together, it kind of makes sense that this is a familial category. But again, that's not explicit in Genesis 2 and 3, and that's a minority position in theology. So this is one of the things I wanted to argue. I wanted to do a PhD and make this case, but I haven't yet had a chance to do that. So, but in Genesis 3:2, chapter 2, you do get a picture of God. He makes Adam out of the dust, and he puts him in a garden. And what's all this stuff about God planting a garden and the rivers flowing, the 4 rivers that flow out of Eden, and the trees? He like spends a lot of time and a lot of words talking about the garden itself. What does that tell you about God? Let me just read it a little more carefully. God formed a man from the dust of the ground, breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. Okay, so there's God, the life giver, which is a fatherly role. Now, Yahweh God planted a garden, and he put the man there. He made all kinds of trees grow that were pleasing to the eye and good for food. In the middle of the garden were the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. A river watering the garden flowed from Eden, and from there it separated into 4 headwaters. I won't name them all. Then he put the man in the garden of Eden to work it and take care of it. By the way, Eden means delight. This is the garden of delight. And the Lord commanded the man, "You're free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat of it, you will surely die." And then he makes him a helper out of his rib, and that's the whole story of the making of Eve. What did you just learn about God and his relationship to Adam? Yep, Matthew.
So, one, he wanted what was good for Adam. Otherwise, he would not have placed him in the garden of delight.
Yeah. Okay, anything else? I was struck once when I read the description of the trees. Tim, yeah. Maybe you can yell it.
I'm getting my exercise in, and I'm also practicing for the next class where I can't actually talk that far to the screen. So.
Okay.
But he also created Eve, right? He knows that Adam needs not just him, but a physical helper there with him. It's not just providing for him directly that way. He also provides that relationship for him.
Yeah, and you use a key word there, provide, right? God's providing Adam for a whole bunch of his needs, relational needs, physical needs for food, and the beauty of the garden. Okay, Nancy?
I was going to say basically the same thing. He was being very specific. He had everything that he needed to provide for him and for the garden and for whatever else he's making. He already had everything planned out. There was to the T, every detail.
Yeah, well said. And he also gives him a job. He includes him in his own work of caring for the garden, the world. God planted the garden. It's his garden. Okay, Adam, you're going to take care of it and look after it and watch it. So, again, there's no language here, but that's a lot of kind of fatherly roles, right? Provision, work, and there's also boundaries, Matt.
Also, you don't really think of it, but God put trust in Adam as a father puts trust in a child. when
Yeah.
they ask him to do a job.
Yes. And he puts a certain amount of trust in him by giving him freedom. You're free to eat from all this that I've given you, but there's a rule. You know, don't eat from this tree in the midst of the garden. And so there's just like kind of parental boundaries, like I'm looking out for what's good for you. So then you get to chapter 3, and kind of like a father, when his child is hiding in the bedroom, you know, in the cowered in the corner looking at the wall because he's done something wrong, the father comes in and finds him and asks, hey, what happened here? And then there's discipline and punishment that follows because, as Hebrews tells us and Proverbs before, you know, the father disciplines those he loves. So my point is just to say, even though the language isn't there, there's a whole bunch of parental roles being taken by God in the creation narrative of Genesis 2 and 3. And then I'm skipping way ahead, but to Exodus, when God sends Moses to Pharaoh, he says, tell Pharaoh to let my people go, because Israel is my firstborn son. So he establishes this aspect of their relationship, that he is the father of Israel. And in fact, if you read back through the rest of the narrative of Genesis, it's not literally true, but it's kind of true. The nation of Israel started with Abraham and Sarah, who could not have kids by any natural means. And so God basically gives them a child that becomes the beginning of this promised seed, this promised nation that he's on covenant, you know, promised to Abraham, to descendants as many as the stars in the sky. So God really created the people of Israel in a sense out of nothing. I mean, he used Abraham and Sarah, but in a way that they couldn't have done naturally because she was barren and past the age of childbearing and all that. So he's created this people, and now he's claiming them as his own, and he's telling Pharaoh that this is my son. And which, by the way, is another biblical worldview difference of like corporate identity. He doesn't say these are my sons, although the narrative does call them the children of Israel. But he says corporately, this group of people, this group of descendants of Abraham are my son, plural. And that doesn't exclude all the girls. That's just the way the language worked. Kind of like in Spanish, where you say muchachos, and there can be muchachas in the room too, but that's how most languages work. English doesn't do that anymore, although it used to. Read a book from 50 years ago and you'll see. Yes, Nancy.
When you said that, that God said that Israel is his firstborn son. We just learned, like in the other classroom, that Jesus is like how Adam was the first Adam and he's like the second Adam, and
Yes.
and then Jesus he represents Israel also, and how he basically lived out in the second part of the Bible. So
absolutely. This is all set up, right, for how Jesus is going to do our vocation for us. But and that's kind of the point, because when Jesus comes and he lives as the second Adam and the new Israel, he does it as the son of the Father and the King of Israel. So like there's king there, but even the king in the ancient world was the son of God. Like that was one of the titles, because he was the sort of the closest one to the God. And he had this special father-son relationship. I think we talked about this last time when we talked about Solomon, and the Davidic covenant. And God said, "You will be like a son to me." And when he wanders off, I'll discipline him, but I'll never remove my covenant love from him. So all the way through, from Adam to Israel to the king to the eventual Messiah, you've got this thread of sonship and family. And I think that's, to your point, Liz, that we don't often preach this. I think that's a biblical theme that we've actually just overlooked for a long time. And it has to do with the fact that we do live in an individualistic culture. We don't think in community categories. We don't think I am a member primarily, first and foremost, of my family and my nation and my tribe. We think I'm a me. I'm an autonomous being. And, if my parents are, if I'm in the mood to like them right now, I'll identify with them. But if if they're not, or if I change my views, then I'll identify with myself or with some other tribe or group. We're very much not so tied in with family and extended family. Now that's not quite as true in Latin American contexts, and even that subpopulation in America still has a lot of that family way of thinking and being, as well as Asian American subgroups. But in the land of the free and the home of the brave, like we're our own people, and we're not born into our parents' social status and into their career. Like we get to do what we want, and I think that's part of what's caused us to miss this kind of family thread through the Bible, and therefore the emphasis on how we are children of God the Father. One other text, and then we can be done. In the prophet Hosea, the prophets are famous for using all kinds of powerful metaphors to talk about God's relationship with his people. One of the most powerful is the marriage metaphor. And that's probably the most prominent and pervasive. But paired up with that, and they kind of bounce back and forth sometimes, is this father-child or mother-child metaphor. And one of the most famous is in Hosea chapter 11. God says, "I myself taught Israel how to walk, leading him along by the hand. But he doesn't know or even care that it was I who took care of him." So, I mean, imagine this scene of this little toddler. They're so cute at that age. They kind of stumble around and they get up and they take a couple steps and then they fall on their bum. But then you grab them by their little hands, and you walk with them and teach them how to do it. And it's a very tender, affectionate thing that a parent does. And God is saying, look, this is who I was to you, Israel. And you didn't get it. You didn't stick with me. And so, again, the theme is not really bold and front and center in the Old Testament, but it is there. And I think part of what Jesus is doing when he comes and teaches us to pray our Father is he's picking up that thread and saying, this is the truth. This is the bedrock. This is how we as Israel and we as the human race need to relate to this God that we have. Because prayer is all about cultivating relationship, and Jesus invites us to pray along with him, our Father. And hopefully you read John 15 through 17, which was part of the reading, and I didn't have time to unpack that, but part of his purpose there on the night before he dies is to say to his disciples, look, I want to wrap you up in this father-son relationship that I share with my Father. I want you to join in and participate in that. if you want to know more about that in that passage, talk to Dan Woodrich. It's his favorite text in the Bible, and he loves to wax eloquent about sharing in Jesus' sonship with the Father. So I'll leave that to him for another time because we are out of time. But I thank you for your participation and attention today. And I hope this was helpful. And I will see you on Thursday. For then, it's the next chapter of Reeves. And I'll get another discussion up, hopefully by the end of the day, but it might be tomorrow. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.